Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third session of the seminar, Modern Monetary Theory, the 16th Century Challenge by Colin Drumm. Today, we're going to have Nikki Roach presenting James MacDonald's paper, A Free Nation Deep in Debt, The Financial Roots of Democracy, to which Alex Cruz will respond to. And after that, James Elsey is going to present Nina Boy's text, The Backstory of the Risk-Free Asset, How Government Debt Became Safe. I'm now passing the mic to Colin Drumm.
Hi everyone, welcome back. So I'm excited today. We're really gonna get into the question of chartalism after kind of some background that we've been doing the last couple of days. So so we read, for instance, the Chartalist Critique of John Locke by Bell et al., which is sort of a foundational text in for the modern monetary theorists. Bell is actually Kelton. So Stephanie Kelton, who is one of the main advocates of MMT and who has a book coming out and has been advising politicians and everything. Stephanie Bell is the same as Stephanie Kelton. So we're going to be talking about this text, and I'll be talking a little bit about the problems with this text because while there's some stuff that it gets right, there's some other important stuff that it gets wrong. And so we're going to be thinking about that through the Nina Boy and of course Shakespeare and some of our historical material about the crisis of the late 16th century. And just to kind of give you an idea, kind of our topics for this class and the final class are really about optionality and lineage. So they bleed together a little bit. So today in some of my remarks, I'm going to be talking about this concept of optionality. And we're going to be showing why this is a concept that will kind of help complexify some of the shortcomings of the chartalist view. But we'll get to all that in a little bit. So first, I'd love to hear the presentations on James MacDonald, and then if our other presenter comes, also the the Nina Boy. So take it away, and then I will respond after we've done that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to talk about the MacDonald text. So MacDonald is working towards an understanding of how national debt came to be in his book, as well as our perception of it, which has changed. How is democracy so entangled with public credit? MacDonald starts with the first evidences of public borrowing in the Bronze and the Dark Ages, and from there he leads us into the modern debt crisis. The section we focused on is set in medieval Europe, and it was a really long section, but I'm going to try to get through it as fast as I can because there was a lot of information. The chapter is set around a set of borrowing experiments that ended with the fall of the Roman Empire, but we start by looking at the problems of Italian city-states not being able to compete with their monarchies who were kind of taking them over. So they transformed borrowing into financial policies. This would cause not only the obvious mismanagement, but unforeseen declines during different events, mostly wars. Wars had also birthed innovative competitive financing technologies or instruments of finance that there's a lot of evidences that we still use a lot of these things today. In the end, we see how a workable credit system helped nations finance war and reduce short-term debt obligation, which were the majority of their debt management. So MacDonald starts with this idea of natural right or ancient rights to taxation. In France and Spain particularly, nation states wanted to stamp out regional autonomy. The Netherlands is brought in because they didn't have much of this problem as a small country with a lot of power distributed in their city-states. So the nation states that were trying to restrict access to money in their city-states, they did so through creating a financial apparatus or an apparatus of fiscal control where the cities would borrow money that they needed, and then the nations would service that debt. The Dutch avoided this generally because revenues that were received were largely in the form of subsidies or grants, but some cities did get into debts, mostly on the Antwerp mark exchange, so they leveraged their subsidies to pay for that debt. The rising costs in military and life caused crises in cities. Cities could be occupied by the nation and if they didn't pay their debts. So they had to borrow more money and tried a number of different tactics to pay it. They invented excise taxes, flat taxes on specific goods. In Spain, city-states imposed sales and export taxes. When war was happening, it was usually very profitable for the Netherlands because of their really successful sea trade, but they had like few people to fight a war. They had wealth instead. To compete with Spain in raising money, the Dutch leveraged credit ratings and especially the credit of their merchant public. While Spain would cycle through different bankruptcies, the Dutch managed to sustain a high public debt and still prosper. The Dutch later replaced excise taxes with taxes on land and houses. And you can kind of see that if you've ever been to like Amsterdam or something where the plots of land are really small and like the buildings are very tall because the land was pretty expensive. When the Dutch had debt crises, they used for wealthy and they suspended debt. So like the crisis didn't expand. The taxes were always going up though, but unlike the Dutch, Italian people, general people were devastated by the war. Many countries were like that. The Dutch had built their own finance markets and then its city-states flourished even more. But it wasn't really the city-state necessarily, it was the urban elite engaging in the trust with the nation. So public borrowing in England, Henry VII had amassed a large fortune, which he had tried to get involved into French politics and failed, and he lost all of his money. Something he did was he took away the power of the Pope during that time and started repossessing the assets of the church. The church's income alone nearly doubled his revenues, and that really pissed off people. He also debased the currency. Currency manipulation became the primary source of his income. Meanwhile, the Protestant Reformation is happening at the time. Protestants are more like ideologically associated with civil liberties than the Catholics, who are seen as more authoritarian. So there's the English Civil War happening, also the Dutch War for independence, and the two have a lot of parallels. But the Dutch were able to finance their war with rents, and the English couldn't do that necessarily because they had more land. So they sold mortgages. The English didn't really have long-term debt, mostly short-term debt, but they borrowed from the Antwerp markets and almost defaulted. Elizabeth's recoinage had stabilized the currency, and the Parliament reduced some of her debts, but the continual financial crisis meant that England had really bad credit. Forced loans had made really bad relationships also with their merchants. The only option left was to borrow from like syndicates of entrepreneurs. So the Stewarts inherited really bad credit, which they hid, but obviously word would get out if a war erupted and they couldn't finance it, which did happen. Parliament got involved, the king was replaced with a commonwealth, the Dutch merchants made really good money on interest, and most of the merchants were like running the financial system. They kind of overpowered their king, Philip II. But England was different. A long parliament was installed to deal with the financial crisis. Long parliament lived on forced loans, unpaid bill fines, and confiscations. Certain practices emerged during this time. There was debt trading, swapping debts for confiscated lands. People were being paid in bonds. It was not long before the Long Parliament failed and was disbanded. Excise taxes were installed and direct taxes based on assessments. The Civil War ended with more taxes than it started with, but England did get ahead of their debts, like the Dutch did. In England at the time, there was also religious fanaticism, war deficit, financial mismanagement, and the cost of maintaining an army during peacetime. The idea of like the practice of tax farming had ended, and collections and disbursements became more centralized in the treasury. And then there was a political revolution in 1688 that financially helped the English achieve a kind of like a similar financial dynamic to the Dutch, one of a strong mercantile republic that could tap the power of public credit. And that challenged the monarchy. The power of the parliament became primarily demoted to legislative powers, and the crown had lost a lot of its rights. And they installed a prime minister. But still, like the urban elites, liquid wealth was the underpinning of the public debt. And MacDonald references the two main political and social groups at the time, the Tories and the Whigs, where often the profits of public debts landed. I mean, if they stayed in England. England's borrowing terms still needed to improve to avoid constant bankruptcies, and slowly the Treasury becoming a virtual state bank. And an imposition was put in place that there was a strict order of repayments on government obligations. So here we have that idea that the government can't run out of money. The Stuarts were broke and kept financing war with France and competing with Holland. And this is how, like, MacDonald kind of frames the start of this notion of long-term national debt. And from here, taxes were raised to unprecedented levels, and the ability to manipulate the money supply became the foundation of the practice of modern central banking. At this time, experiments in paper money became more common. The bank was able to issue notes in payments of its liabilities, the notes of a nominal value. And there was also the first reminting since Elizabeth, which occurred about 100 years after Elizabeth. Reminting reduced the money stock and caused deflation and worsened England's credit. And they also lightened the weight of the coin. Meanwhile, the Protestants and Catholics were wreaking havoc on governmental positions. Post the Reformation, the Tories and the Whigs also were engaged in political power moves. The trading of the notes was pretty good, though, and so were the annuities from the large trading companies. So the financial footing of England got stronger. The government was dominated by Whigs at the time, which is the more mercantile class. But an election swung in favor of the Tories when another financial crisis hit, and the Tories were more middle-class conservatives. Each crisis consisted again and again of short-term debt, and the Treasury issued new bills, which were cheap and traded well, and they were underwritten through the Bank of England. But slowly, long-term obligations began to overwhelm the government. But what did the Tories do? They mismanaged things really, really poorly. The government stocks collapsed. The objective of England's war with France was revealed to be a financing scheme for certain Whig merchants. The Tories got out of government and they pocketed what they could. The English government resorted to a debt equity swap, in which the largest trading companies, for instance, the South Sea Company, sold their shares in their company for government bonds. Because of this, England was able to finance the rest of their war and accumulate little short-term debt. Yeah, that was the end of that section of the book.
Great, thank you. I think so. We have a respondent now. Who's going to go?
Yes, Alex is responding.
Yeah, thanks, Nikki. That was a really clarifying presentation. So I had a couple questions for you that came up for me. So two concepts that recurred throughout the chapter that I was thinking about were like revolution and religion, and you spoke to those like quite a bit, but I was thinking of like why exactly, if you could just clarify, like both revolutions in England and the Netherlands eventuated in higher taxes than those which had actually fomented those revolutions. So I think he talks about that on page 154 in the chapter, that regardless of a revolt success or failure, taxes were massively increased. And so I was kind of having difficulty tracing that inevitability, and maybe you went through that, but I just kind of missed it. I don't know if you get to speak to that at all.
I think it was just because there was so much debt every time there was an upheaval and every time there was a war, and they just had to find some way to pay for that debt. And even when there was a new person in power, someone had inherited the debt. And that was really successful in the Netherlands was because they had strong mercantile class that paid a lot of taxes. So England kind of was copying from them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Something else that came up, and this might get into the boy a little bit too, just thinking about notions of faith and trust and religiosity in those societies. And so I was kind of curious, like maybe Colin could speak to this too. I wasn't sure like why Protestantism has presumed democratic underpinnings as opposed to Catholicism, and how the sort of like constructs, these religious constructs, shaped the material and monetary realities of the people, the public, and the crown. Because I mean, it seemed like, I think it was Charles I, right? really like indulged in the Catholic liturgy and just really seemed to was very enamored with seeming like a god or something. And I don't know, like that just
I believe you have in mind. I believe you have in mind James II, who is the,
James II. Sorry,
who is the Catholic. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right. So, yeah, if you could speak to that at all, just like the rift between those two religious modes of thought, and yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I can't speak so much on the religious aspect of it, but just trust is, even though we talk about trust a lot, and it was very evident in Shakespeare how like cronyism worked and how these systems were so reliant on trust, but yet money is a contract. Like all these contracts are happening, like credit is based on trust, but like how do we have any like contractual engagement based on trust? I don't understand it. And this idea of contract, I wonder if it is just an instrument of austerity. And it's just like a linguistic trap. It's like a swap of good money for bad money, or good for bad contracts. Like, I don't know how much, like when I think about trust, I kind of see like a big hole there. But yeah, they're using this trust maybe to just like have good credit. Maybe Colin, what do you think?
No, this is fantastic. This brings us into a lot of what I wanted to talk about today. I mean, part of the question that we are asking is the extent to which money is a contract or not, right? And if we believe that money is a pure contract, then this raises the question of collateral, right? So we have the idea of money as a pure uncollateralized contract. This is the view that's kind of presented in MMT. And so part of precisely the question that I wanted us to talk about today is the question of whether we can understand money as purely a contract, or whether there is something else in money, and what that might be. So that's a hint. I'm gonna get there as I develop some of my thoughts. But I want to just respond a little bit to what we were saying about MacDonald. So I mean, I think maybe you noticed. I mean, so MacDonald's book is what we will call a Whiggish history. Okay, so MacDonald's book is a liberal ideological story about the history of the financial system. And so it is Whiggish in the sense both of being of the party of the Whigs, who you read about in chapter 4, and Whiggish in the sense of being a teleological history. There is something that the history of public finances leading up to, which is democracy, right? So also James MacDonald is in favor of democracy, in favor of finance, right? He's trying to show you how democracy is inherently a constitutional order based around public finance. And what it is fundamentally characterized by is an identity between sovereign and subject. Okay, we could say that this is the liberal constitution. The liberal constitution says the subjects are the sovereign. This is the idea of popular sovereignty. And what I think is valuable about MacDonald, we have to read MacDonald through the lines a little bit, which is true of a lot of monetary financial history. It's mostly written by kind of people working from kind of an English liberal perspective. And so it's so we have to read through it a little bit. But what's interesting about this is that James MacDonald shows us how really what's at stake in establishing this liberal constitutional order that establishes an identity between sovereign and subject is an issue of the public credit. Because the point is that if the people who are administering the state are also holders of the state debt, then their interests become aligned with the public, right? This is the idea. So if, so for example, the Elizabeth, the Tudors, the Stewarts are not holding wealth in the form of their own debt, right? I mean, they issue debt because they want to raise money, and there is a contradiction between the interests of the issuers of the public debt and the holders of the public debt. They aren't. So if I am issuing the public debt, my interest is in inflation because I'm a debtor And so I would like the money to be worth less. Whereas if I'm holding the public debt, my interest is in deflation. I would like the price of money to go up so that my debt is worth more. And there's a conflict of interest there. The idea is that in this constitutional order based around what MacDonald calls the Dutch model, you have the establishment of at least the appearance of an identity between sovereign and subject that aligns the interests of policyholders with the interests of debt holders, right? Because the policymakers are themselves holders of debt. And so this is the origin. You might hear this statement being made in discourses about public debt, is the idea that it is money that we owe to ourselves. And so precisely the question is this establishment of the we. It's no longer the royal we, but it is the public we, or the we of the public and the royal we become identified with one another. And for MacDonald, this is good. This is the end of history. Right now we live where, we have democracy. And the only problem is going to arise when sort of this liberal constitution gets disrupted for some reason. Now, what is interesting, and Alex, I'm glad that you raised this point, there's a paradox for MacDonald, which is that tax revolts in the early modern period end up in raising taxation, right? So the Netherlands revolts against what it considered the unjust taxation of Philip II. And in the process of developing the fiscal and financial infrastructure that enables them to prosecute the war against Philip, they end up taxing themselves way more. And the same thing happens in the English context at the end of the 17th century, into the 19th century, that actually England, so as we see, in the 16th century, in our period that we're mostly focusing on, England has maybe an eighth of the total revenues of the French king, right? They simply do not have the kind of fiscal muscle to really throw around. But what they at the outcome of this process, they end up taxing themselves more, right? It's the same thing with the Long Parliament. You chop the head off the king because he repudiates the debt, and now you install a parliament that is having forced loans or doing all kinds of stuff that is supposedly what you were trying to avoid. That's the reason you started the war in the first place. So what's going on with this model, right? This is, I think, what is really interesting about MacDonald. And so this kind of will lead us into the boy, because precisely the point is that the establishment of the liberal constitution that identifies the sovereign with the subject is what provides the legitimacy that is necessary in order to back the public debt with taxation. Because in order to raise credit cheaply as public debt, I have to be able to essentially tax at will. And this is not the case in the Ancien regime. The English king had enormous difficulties taxing, right? So the king actually had to summon parliament. So the way this all works, maybe you've picked it up from some of the readings or not, but the way that it works is that the king, if he wants to get some money, has to summon parliament who will vote him what's called a subsidy. So a subsidy is just a parliament voting to tax itself to give to the king, and it has a kind of traditional fixed amount of the subsidy. But in order to do this, the king has to hear the grievances of parliament. So this is kind of how the power negotiation works, is that the king has to summon parliament. Parliament can't just meet on its own unless the king summons it. The king summons parliament because he wants revenue, he wants a subsidy. But in order to do that, he now has to allow parliament to present him with their grievances. And he has to hear the grievances and give them redress first before they can vote on the subsidy. And of course, as we've spoken about in previous sessions, the value of the subsidy and the revenues to the crown were being eroded by the inflation of the 16th century. So by the end of the 16th century, the parliament is being asked to grant 3 or 4 subsidies because the value of money has collapsed so low. So when we're thinking about the grievances, remember and we're going to look at this scene in a little bit in Henry II Part 2, Act 4, Scene 1. There's the whole scene where the rebels present their grievances to the king before they're betrayed. So anyway, so the question of the liberal constitutional order being about the legitimacy necessary to pledge revenue to raise debt safely and reliably. Like, so for example, the University of California does exactly this, right? So essentially the reason that the University of California is able to borrow money at pretty cheap rates is because their creditors know that they have more or less unilateral power to raise tuition. So the UC can raise tuition basically however it wants, and there's almost nothing that anybody can do about it. They can take away my money just by raising fees on me, right? They can, and we tried to go on strike, and now I'm never going to work for the University of California again. I mean, we failed, right? So this is very much what's going on in the sort of background of the risk-free asset. Okay, there's more I can say about that, but I'd like to hear, since we've raised Boy, maybe we can hear our presentation on that.
Hey, yeah, that's me.
Great.
I was a bit late. I was having some technical issues.
Well, I'm glad you joined us.
Didn't frighten you and think I wasn't going to do the presentation. Let me just find it. Cool. Okay. Yeah. So the backstory of the risk-free asset: how government debt became safe, by Nina Boy. Nina Boy is an academic based at the University of Warwick. And her research is based at the intersection of security studies and international political economy, focusing on conceptions of insecurity in global finance. And her list of academic credits tends to center around the subjects discussed in this particular paper. Her work sits at the kind of nexus between finance, risk analysis, and political economy. And in this paper, Boy predictably traces the historical development of the situation in which government debt became the most common form of collateral in the financial system. So in brief, she draws a link between this phenomenon and some of the processes we discussed in the last session, that there's been contingent on the state's ability to tax and print money. This, she claims, is the perspective of standard economics and modern finance theory. Which, sort of as an aside, I was wondering if this term is like distinct from modern monetary theory. This is contrasted, she said, with the perspective of economic history, which tells us that there's no such thing as a perfectly safe sovereign. And the question she poses is if and how we can reconcile these seemingly incompatible tensions, that sovereign safety is an axiom of modern finance, as well as its contingency and mytho-poetic basis. So Boy argues that the sovereign debt crisis of 2007 and 8 reframed the riskiness of these assets, and scholars in the wake came to assert that the debt was never actually risk-free. It was just treated as if it were. So kind of we'll expand on that in a minute. An axiom of modern economics is that it perpetually tries to epistemologically differentiate itself from fiction. So Boy kind of touches this nerve in the rest of the paper, finding it's quite useful in understanding some of these earlier points. Boy outlines two different angles from which economic history makes sense of the emergence of sovereign debt. On one hand, economic historians might point to successive debt crises over the centuries, which have occurred in waves. For example, from the 1870s to 90s, we see these flare up again in the interwar years, and successively the 1980s Mexican debt crisis, 90s East Asian crisis, and into the 2000s in Latin America. It seems these have defied predictions and implicated the fickleness of confidence in the markets, to the point where some have labelled them entirely ahistorical. So yeah, this idea that they've been like come out the blue has led people to perhaps, so you can contest whether it's ahistorical, but yeah, Boy's kind of riffing off that. The other perspective is one of sovereign accreditation, in which the historical defaults are slowly forgotten. This is comprised of what Boy describes as two intertwined processes. One is the voluntary repayment by the sovereign, and two, the voluntary investment in sovereign bonds. To address these in order, how do we understand the voluntary repayment by the sovereign? Well, we might ask, would a sovereign who can wield this power care about repaying debts when they aren't coerced into it? the reputation of sovereigns to pay their debts has helped to discipline their behaviour to ensure creditors would still lend to them. The uncertainty of the period for which this lasts helps to normalise indebtedness as a trait which does not always tarnish reputation. So if the state had like defaulted on its debts, 200 years ago, that is almost like the kind of like amnesia which is applied to it kind of helps to account for like their trustworthiness almost being restored sometimes. The first market in government debt was created in Florence in 1345 when third parties could exchange a consolidated set of credits. However, this was still a bit coercive and based on a moral duty from the citizenry to the government. Boy kind of highlights the British post-revolutionary period in the late 17th century as the emergence of a voluntary public credit following two developments. One being the parliamentary guarantee of government loans following the Glorious Revolution of 1688, turning royal debts into debts of the nation. And number two, the foundation of a central bank with the Bank of England in 1694. The nature of public as we understood it today was forged in this, as the Bank of England was in fact private in legal terms, and paradoxically, the privately owned Bank of England transformed the sovereign's personal debt into public currency. However, we must be careful, Boy argues, of neatly defining a threshold between public and private for conceptualizations of this historical period. So the interdependence of the Bank of England, South Sea Company and East India Company was such that buying stock in these private companies amounted to indirectly investing into the national government, since they are major creditors of the state. This dynamic allowed a phase shift between a highly illiquid 17th century into a new era of 18th century liquidity, in which the gendered characters of fanciful lady credit, who was seen as a temptation and whose desires needed to be disciplined, contrasted with the rational financial man whose new techniques of double entry bookkeeping allowed him to assert order. Where previous sovereigns might laugh off their debts and utilize their monopoly on violence to default, modern states had come to see debts as inherently lawful and legitimate by the 19th century. Since the 1940s, advanced economies have not defaulted on their debts, usually. If debt is seen as conditionally spanning the future, in the words of, Boy quotes Lepine, excuse my pronunciation, the entailment of which is an uncertainty whose price is paid in interest. Liquid debt asserts to the predictability and unprofitability of the present. Boy quotes Keynes, who argued that interest is not a reward for saving, but for parting with liquidity. But yeah, what is liquidity in a technical sense? And Lepine describes it as an index of the common world. It depends on plausible narratives and trust. So this next section talks about this in more depth in this sort of fictional generation of trust. And Boy quotes Nicky Marsh saying that the paradox of credit, transmutation of the insubstantial into the substantial, has been a productive one for literary critics, as it suggests an obvious parallel with the action of literature itself. Early political economic texts shared much of the features of the literary form of the novel, but it was the gradual differentiation of these two genres of writing based on stabilizing a distinction between fact and fiction that affected the naturalization of credit instruments. And they effectively passed into perceptibly acultural realm. How does monetary epistemology translate into the literary context? Boy writes that the sincerity of the novel warrants the secure investment of the reader, who, she then quotes Bratlinger in saying, gives as full credit to the narrative as to the funds, because it will contain nothing extravagantly romantic, sensational, or improbable. In this sense, fiction created a model of the world in which there's a logical consistency with our own. So yeah, to me, this seems to link to ideas of modeling in financial industries, whose computational power is leveraged at modeling real-world interactions in an attempt to create maybe a Borgian map of the planet's flows of materials and people and capital, or perhaps in the sense of modeling, trying to restore, having some predictability in virus modeling that we're seeing with coronavirus, in creating a fiction that actively replicates the world. And yeah, we're generally able to better invest in a fictional version of the world when it is perceived as closely resembling our own. And Boy quotes Esposito to say, to be realistic, the novel cannot be real, but helps to contribute to the increasing acceptance of fictional realities. As Vernon states, as money was becoming more fictional, fiction was becoming more realistic. Crucially, Boy writes that the novel underwrote the credibility of government debt by letting its fragility disappear. So public credit paradoxically formed from successive crises. So, for example, the aforementioned situation in Florence in 1345, the Bank of England's creation, and first paper money, all were situations born from insolvency. Yeah, and BlackRock responding to the credit crisis by raising credit no longer based on liquidity, but on isolation from external shock, placing countries like Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland as high on the scale. Boy wraps up by saying it's not useful to understand this situation purely from the vantage of either economic history or financial theory. She quotes Heinzelman saying that fictions work even when they are recognized as fictions, which kind of, from my knowledge background, kind of reminds me of the CCRU idea of hyperstition, and how a fiction, it can be useful even if you don't believe in it. So the domain which is best placed to examine this, Boy asserts, is an interstitial space between public, private, and fact fiction, where the co-evolutions of these dynamics can be examined. Yeah, okay. That's kind of what I had on it.
Great, thank you very much. Good, so there's several points that I would like to make here, and then I'll get into my kind of main topic for today. So just briefly to circle back around to this question about the liberal constitution and its relation to Protestantism, and what is the role of the Reformation in this. So I mean, first to observe is that the Reformation was very much about a revolt of sort of the Northern European merchant cities against the financial dominance of the church, right? So we talked a little bit last time about the role of the church in regulating exchange by bills in order to prevent dry exchange, which is the use of bills of exchange in order to augment the money supply. And so, but at a level of theology, if we think back to at the very beginning of Richard II, when Richard is being presented in 1-1 with the complaints of Mowbray and Bolingbroke, and he says, "I was born to command, not to sue," or he says, "I was born to command, but not to sue," or not to sue, but to command, I believe that he says, right? So he says that his power is a power of command, and it is not a question of suing. It is not a question of legal engagement with the subject, right? So what you have and I think we can relate this to Protestantism's emphasis on covenant theology, right? So Protestantism kind of gets rid of the hierarchy of the church, which, let's notice, is very much the issue of indulgences and the issue of paying money in order to absolve yourself of sin is one of the major complaints of the Protestants against the church, precisely because it is a sort of it's the church's fiscal system. I mean, the church is making a lot of money by allowing people to pay off their sins and all of this stuff. And so you in part of this resistance to the hierarchy of the church, you get the idea. You go back to the book of Genesis with the covenant between God and humans, and you really make that the basis of your theology. And this is transferred to an idea about sovereignty, right? So you get the idea that the sovereign has a covenantal or a legal relationship to his subjects in a way that is kind of foreign to medieval Christianity's conception of the relation between sovereign and subject. So that would be kind of my short answer of like, what does Protestantism have to do with this whole thing? So then, James, you asked the question about kind of just a factual question about modern financial theory, and is that the same as modern monetary theory? And the answer is no, definitely not. And if anything, part of what we're doing in this seminar is a kind of dialectic between modern financial theory and modern monetary theory. Maybe I'll try to explain what I mean by that. So modern financial theory or modern portfolio theory is developed in the early 70s. So, and particularly around the development of the Black-Scholes-Merton equation. I don't know if you want to know about this, a good place to start is Donald McKenzie has a book called An Engine, Not a Camera, that is about the performativity of financial markets. So what the Black-Scholes-Merton equations did was to provide a formula for the pricing of options. So I want to talk a little bit about options today. So just to define what options are, vanilla options, basic options are divided into puts and calls. I think I may have talked about this in a previous session, but we can repeat it. So a put, if I own a put, I have the right but not the obligation to sell an asset in the future at a given price. If I have a call, I have the right but not the obligation to buy a given asset in the future at a given price. Now, puts and calls have been sold for several thousand years. We have examples of forward contracts in commodities from Mesopotamia. But what didn't exist was a very good way to price them. And so they were very, very expensive. So in the early 20th century compared to today, purchasing puts and calls was very expensive. It was a very expensive way to hedge your risk. What the Black-Scholes-Merton equation did was originally intended to have a way to price an option. And essentially, the basic idea is that the price of an option is going to vary with the volatility of the underlying. So if I have an option on corn, my option is going to be more valuable the more volatile corn is. Because if I know if corn is not volatile, if corn always sells at the same price, then the option is worthless because there's no chance that the price of corn is going to change enough in order to make my option come into the money, or in other words, be worth something. Because if the price of corn is 80 and I have a call option to buy it at 100, my option is worthless because all I have is the right but not the obligation to buy corn for more than it's worth, and that's not worth anything. So the more volatile the underlying becomes, the more valuable the option becomes. And so originally, the Black-Scholes-Merton equation is developed in order to allow you to look at the historical volatility, so the actual volatility of the price of the underlying for some period of the past. And if you assume that the future volatility is going to be the same as the past, then the Black-Scholes equation allows you to price the option, but only in reference to a risk-free rate. So the equation, in order to work, and I can't tell you any more details about the math than this, but it requires there to exist some reference rate of a risk-free rate of return. And it is only then that the equation allows you essentially to price the risk of an asset separately from the asset itself. So if I know what the risk-free rate of return is, so if I know that a US government bond is risk-free and it will give me 5%, then I know that the risk-free rate of return is 5%. And so if my asset that I'm writing an option on differs from the risk-free rate, this must relate to its risk. And so I can price the risk of the asset separately by referring it to the risk-free rate. And this entire concept depends upon the idea that such an asset exists in the economy, and that is the role played by the by U.S. Government debt. So what is interesting about this is that it requires, how to put this, it requires the idea that money itself is not an option. So that like what I am pricing is the difference between whatever it is whose risk I'm trying to evaluate, and money, which is itself something riskless. And as we're seeing in the history that we're reading, this has not been the case, right? This has to be produced historically. And Boy focuses on the end of the 18th century, the end of the 17th century. And what I'm trying to sort of show you is the way that this transitional period in the 17th century grows out of this political conflict in the earlier time. So, okay, so what is interesting about options is that an option is essentially time and the power to choose. So if I own an option, what is valuable about it is that I don't have to decide yet, right? I have the power to decide about something in the future. So I have both time and the power to choose. And this is what I want us to examine in Shakespeare, and we'll talk about this more next time, but a little bit this time, is the choices that Henry makes, the options that he has. How does he exercise his options as a sovereign? And how does Hal's ability to exercise his options fit into Shakespeare's idea of his idea of ideal kingship, right? And the reason this is interesting to me is precisely because of, I think, what we talked about in the first session, this question of sovereign servility. Because what we are presented with in our discourse about the public and money is the idea that the sovereign is essentially powerless, that the sovereign has no options, that the sovereign, so George Bush has to, bail out the troubled asset. He has to pass troubled asset relief program for trillions of dollars, because if he doesn't, then the economy won't exist when we wake up on Monday. This is what his advisors tell him, right? So we have this idea that the sovereign has no options. And so what matters about the idea of options? So maybe we can distinguish between a choice and an option, right? So liberal political philosophy is entirely based upon the idea of a choice. That is the idea that the choice is the condition of freedom. If we have choices, then you are free, because what you chose is what you wanted, and what you got is what you chose. And if you have any complaints about the way the world is, it can only be because you made a wrong choice in some kind of way, or you actually deserve what you chose. So why is an option different from a choice? I think we can see this if we consider Hegel's master-slave dialectic and the position of the bondsman in the dialectic, because the bondsman in Hegel precisely is presented with a choice, and the choice is work or die, right? So it's difficult to see why the choice of work or die is a condition of freedom, right? I mean, this sort of undermines this fundamental plank of liberal philosophy. Now, if this is inadequate, and if I'm saying that an option is something different, what is an option? Well, what is different about an option from a choice is that it is virtual in Deleuze's sense, in that an option has value even if you don't exercise it, or even if you cannot exercise it, right? So even if it is impossible for me to exercise my option, to choose to do what the option enables me to do, it still might have value, right? So for example, it might have value as a bluff. It might have value because the world might change in such a way to make my option valuable. So even if I have, so for example, if you thought 3 months ago that Corona was going to be a major problem for the global financial system, you could have bought puts on the stock market or on various different things. So you could have bought far out of the money puts, and you can buy them for very cheaply, right? So these would be puts that enable you, give you the right to sell the asset for way, way less than it's currently worth. And so this is only going to be valuable if, you know, a black swan happens, something that we can't predict, that makes the future different from the past, in which case they come into the money, right? So we see this, and we'll see it some more in Henry V when we look at it next time. But there are, at the end of Henry IV, part 2, there are a number of scenes of either forgiveness or repudiation. And this is kind of what I want us to talk about a little bit here. And then I'm going to talk about Bell et al. After that. So there's first of all 4-1, the scene with the rebels, where essentially what happens is that you know, they get the rebels to agree to disband their army in return for hearing their grievances, right? So the rebels essentially say, Henry IV has become a king like Richard. He is doing all of this illegitimate stuff, and we are dying of the same disease that we were under Richard. And so we need our grievances to be heard. And the agents of the king say, okay, yeah, great, bring us your grievances. We'll hear your grievances. Because why? Well, because Henry IV is wise, and he knows that punishing rebels often just makes 2 more rebels rise in their place. And so this is really not the way to secure the social stability. And so we're going to be merciful, right? The sovereign is going to exercise his option for mercy. And then we get this, right? And then as soon as they receive word that the army has been disbanded, they arrest all of the leaders for treason. And they say, well, just because we agreed to hear your grievances doesn't mean that we're going to respect your person as the leader of the rebels, right? And so there's this idea that rather than these lords themselves being the rebels, they are simply the representatives of the interest of the rebels. And there's a difference between the kind of the represented and the representative. And so the representative can be punished for the treason, even though we're going to hear the grievances of them. And then there are 2 other scenes. So there is the scene in 5-2 where the justice of the peace is worried, right? So the story here is that as a young man, Henry IV, as the prince, had basically caused a scene in the courthouse, had punched the judge, and the judge sent him to prison, even though he was the prince. And the question, and he's worried that because he has this history with Hal, now that Hal has become Henry V, he's going to punish me for disrespecting his person. And the judge kind of gives this speech that says, when I threw you in jail, I was exercising the authority of your father, right? It wasn't really me. I was acting in favor of the law. And now that you're the king, you would also want your servants to act like I did, and so don't hold a grudge against me. And Hal agrees to do this, right? So he declines to exercise his option for revenge against his personal enemies now that he has become the king. And similarly, when Falstaff arrives, and at the very end in 5-5, and he gives the speech that says, "I know thee not, old man," and he is repudiating Falstaff, right? So there are these multiple scenes at the end of the play in which we kind of have this contradiction between there's an openness of options that the sovereign has, which is that the sovereign can punish or the sovereign can forgive. And part of the sovereign's power comes from the fact that those he exercises this power against don't know yet whether he is going to be merciful or whether he is going to be vengeful, right? And so if we knew that he was going to be merciful, then he wouldn't have the power. If we knew that he was going to be vengeful, then he also wouldn't have the power, right? If the rebels knew that the king was going to punish them, then they never would have surrendered, and they never would have disbanded their army. And so there is a struggle between the sovereign and these other figures that is kind of characterized by what I call indecision. So I'll talk about this more next time, I think, in more detail. But if you've read Carl Schmitt, if you're familiar with Carl Schmitt, his theory of political theology, right, is all based upon the idea of the decision. sovereign is he who decides, he says at the beginning of political theology. But what I want to suggest is that what we see here is that Shakespeare kind of has a different and I think better conception than Schmidt, which is that sovereignty, the sovereign is he who hasn't decided yet. And the problem is that every time you make a decision, now we have, like, things become a problem again. The making of the decision opens up a problem because now we've decided to execute the rebels, and now they might, this might create more rebellion down the road and all of this stuff. And so there is this idea that power or sovereignty might really come from indecision rather than decision. And there's some important scenes in this regard in Henry V that I want to talk about next time. So having introduced this idea of optionality, and I hope you get kind of an idea of what an option is. And what I'm trying to suggest to you is that option is a financial concept. It is a kind of financial contract that we can trade and sell that are really more common after 1971, after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. So precisely because the Bretton Woods system collapses in the crisis of the 70s, and now currencies float against one another, right? So as opposed to the Bretton Woods system, 1945 to early 70s, where you had a stable exchange rate. So there's no such thing as currency risk, right? So if you're importer, exporter, your supply chain has 5 different currencies in it, you don't need to worry because it's all pegged by the Bretton Woods system. After the 70s, all of these currencies start to float. And so you need puts and calls. Like, one of the main uses of options markets is for international corporations to hedge their currency risk, right? So you can say, okay, my supply chain involves me buying soybeans, from Australia or whatever. And so now what am I? Well, I am short the Australian currency, right? So that what that means is that if the Australian currency goes up, the soybeans I'm importing become more expensive and I lose. So I'm short the Australian currency. And so if I can figure out exactly how short I am, then I can buy calls on the Australian currency, right? So if I buy calls, that means that if the currency goes up, the Australian dollar goes up, now my calls come into the money and I've hedged my risk, right? So puts and calls are a way to hedge currency risk, among other things. And that's part of why they become so important. That's part of why Black-Scholes-Merton and the Nixon shock and all of this stuff kind of are happening around the same moment. And okay, so options are a financial contract, but what I'm arguing partly to you is that option is also an ontological category. It is not just finance, and it is any time that any kind of entity has time and the power to choose, right? If you have the power to delay decision, you do not need to decide yet. That is worth something. And it is worth something, it is power, the more volatile the world is, right? Because the more I can leave my options open, I can hold my options open, the more that I gain the power to respond to unexpected things that happen in the future. And this is something that is true about ontology. It's not something that's true about finance, right? So I'm very much not somebody who is going to tell you that sort of finance is I'm never going to tell you that we're making a mistake by applying financial categories to the real world. My view is that there is something ontologically true about some of these financial categories that are true before finance. So, I mean, just in the same way, if we think about very ancient state structures, like having a granary with a bunch of grain in it is an option, because I have the option to either withhold the grain from people if they come to me and they're starving, or I can give it to them, right? And this is the option of having a granary with soldiers around it that has a lot of food in it is a kind of optionality that is fundamental to ancient state structures, just for an example. Okay, so now that we have kind of this concept of option, I want to talk a little bit about the Chartist critique of John Locke. So the argument of the Chartist critique of John Locke is essentially to refute the notion of money that derives ultimately from Aristotle. So basically all theories of money come from Aristotle's discussion in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 5. And essentially what Aristotle says is that we need to trade things, right? So these theories of money begin with the idea of trade, the idea that people want to trade things, and so they need some kind of standard in order to evaluate their relative values and all of this kind of stuff. And essentially the argument is that it's kind of cumbersome and difficult to trade stuff directly, and so people spontaneously develop money as a way to lower the transaction costs of exchange, right? So the idea is that exchange is primordial, it is originary, and that there are transaction costs associated with exchange because, you know, it's more difficult to cart stuff around. And so everybody agrees to use money because it's in everybody's interest, because it lowers everybody's transaction costs. This is what they call the transaction cost theory of money. And so the other, and so they are concerned to refute this idea, along with the way that John Locke uses it to justify the accumulation of private property. And their argument against this is essentially to locate the origin of money in Mesopotamian city temple accounting, right? So their origin of money is in unit of account, and basically their argument is, you know, money comes about because the state or the central place or the god of the temple or whatever is able to impose unilateral liabilities on the public. And what I mean by that is that the temple doesn't trade anything to you for demanding that you bring it sheep. You just owe the temple sheep because God says so, period. So it's a unilateral liability that is imposed on the public by the central place. And their argument is that eventually this liability itself can be used as money. So essentially, what the priests in the temple realize is that they can issue tokens of this unilaterally imposed liability, and then it's worth something because people can use it to pay their taxes, right? So the priests show up and they say, all right, it's time for you to give me a sheep, but you have a little sheep token, and you say, oh, good news, I don't have to really give you a sheep because I have this sign of a sheep that I acquired from you previously in some way. So the fact that you've imposed a liability on me, but I own your liability, and these things can kind of cancel out, right? So they locate all money in unit of account. And this is the really important thing, because what is important is that it leads them to say a bunch of stuff that is about coinage and about the coinage economies of the 5th century Mediterranean that are absolutely ludicrous. Everything they say in that essay about coins is wrong. And what is most astounding is the claim that Greek city-states used gold and silver in coins for purely cultural reasons. Essentially, the argument is that they could have used anything. All coins are just a token, right? This is the argument of MMT, is that all money is ultimately just a token issued by the state. And so their claim is that when the Eastern Aegean was monetized in the 5th century, that these coins were made of precious metals purely because they liked it, right? Or that it was just they could have used any kind of material, but they chose to use this because it's an astounding claim, because it's not really clear. I mean, so, you know, like the Athenians spent a ton of effort they had this mine called Laurion, and they had all these slaves and stuff mining they put an enormous amount of effort into getting a fairly rare material in order to make coins out of it. And so the question is, why, like, the only thing that we can think about this from the perspective of MMT is that they're just irrational. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't really need to do this. They could have made them out of wood. So why didn't they, right? But I think that given some of the stuff that we've been reading, we could, if we had more time in the seminar, we could study the Eastern Aegean, the Greek stuff, and all that stuff. But given what we've been reading in the early modern England, I hope that you can see that the metal really matters. And it matters precisely because of the fact that the metal in the coin is an option. And it is an option on international money, okay? This is what I want to suggest to you, is that the coin, so I talked before in the first session about how the coin has two prices. The coin necessarily has two prices because of Gresham's law, because if it has an intrinsic price that is equal to the money price, then it won't circulate as money. And you need to open the spread in order to make it circulate. The problem is that essentially, what does this intrinsic value of the coin represent? Well, it represents an option to melt down the coin and export it into a foreign economy, right? And that really matters for the circulation of money, even domestically, right? And there is a contradiction between these two different things. And so people have often noted that MMT has a kind of weakness in regard to the foreign sector, right? It's obvious to see why, the United States can't run out of money because it prints the money. And then the question is always, well, okay, but doesn't that only work for the imperial hegemon? Like, what about other countries? And the MMT response, kind of has been, yes, we know that it only, we're not claiming that our theory describes economies that aren't monetarily sovereign, right? These other economies don't meet our criteria. But what they don't really have a great theory of is how would you acquire monetary sovereignty if that were your goal, right? Why don't peripheral countries have monetary sovereignty? What prevents them from acquiring it? So, I mean, there were some plans floated around the Greek debt crisis about sort of how, from an MMT perspective, about how Greece could acquire monetary sovereignty by issuing debit cards and using tax arrears as money and kind of all of this kind of stuff. But they don't really have a satisfactory story about like why it's not as easy as all of that. And what I want to suggest, and I don't know that I have this totally figured out yet, but my line of thinking about this is to begin by saying the stuff that Bell et al. Say in A Charles Critique of John Locke about coins is wrong, because I know that the amount of metal in the coins really matters, because people are fighting over this all the time. And it matters for keeping the coins in circulation, because as we've seen, you have to debase the coins in order to keep them in circulation, or else they go out. So there's a way in which the option to melt the coin really matters for the coin, and it matters because it can't go too low or too high, right? Either way, you're going to have a problem. If the coin becomes totally debased, you have a problem, because the public actually does lose faith in your money, and they might, it's not. So MMT imagines essentially that the state has what Nina Boy would call, maybe, or what I is taking some of Nina Boy's language, would call it total security apparatus, right? So she talks about securities and securitization. If the state has unlimited military legal jurisdiction and can force everybody to take its money, even if it's bad, then it can reduce the option in the money to zero. And this did happen, like in the Roman Empire. Like in the Roman Empire, most of the circulating money is basically worthless, because there wasn't really another game in town. There wasn't really any ability to export your money to the outside, or to withdraw from needing to pay debts or fines in Roman coin. And so they could kind of set the power. But the issue is that until the outcome of this political history that we're looking at, until really the early 18th century in England, in order for money to circulate in the economy, it had to have collateral in it. It was collateralized, right? And so I just want to look just at this. So this is scene 4.1, and it is so this is scene 4.1, the very end, right after they've sort of betrayed the trust of these rebels. And Mowbray asks, this is the son of the previous Mowbray, he says, is this proceeding just and honorable? So he says, how do you have the right to do this? Is this honorable? And Westmoreland replies, is your assembly so? Right? So the question is, which is just? Is what the state has done just, or is perhaps the assembly itself unjust? The Archbishop asks, will you thus break your faith? And Prince John replies, I pawned thee none. What does that mean? I pawned thee none. It means, I didn't give you any security. I didn't give you any collateral. How can you expect me to hold my promises, to keep my promises, if I didn't have any collateral, right? I mean, it's collateral. It's the fact that you hold my hostages. So remember in Henry IV, Part 1, the conflict at the beginning of that play is about the exchange of hostages, and is about Henry IV's refusal to participate in the circulation of noble hostages that give security to credit relations. So, but John says, I pawned thee none. I didn't give you any security, so I don't have to keep my promises, right? I promised you redress of these same grievances whereof you did complain, which by mine honor I will perform with the most Christian care. But for you rebels, look to taste the due meat for rebellion, right? So the whole question is, if the coin has to contain collateral in the form of the option to melt, of the option to export, and it is this struggle over who holds the collateral and whether or not it's worth it to break my promise if the price is giving up the collateral, the question then becomes, if money becomes decollateralized, so if we live in a world where there is only bad money and none of our money has collateral in it, then where did the safety go, right? And I think kind of the suggestion is that the safety goes into kind of a threat against the king, right? I mean, the fact that the king can't do what he wants because that will lead to civil war, because Parliament has the kind of military ability to threaten the king. So as I hope you saw in the two readings by Uthwaite about Elizabeth's relation to the Antwerp exchange, there we had a political conflict about the question of like who's in charge, right? I mean, the crown is borrowing from the merchants, and the problem is that this gives the merchants like way too much power over the crown, and so this is why Elizabeth spends the entire first part of her reign trying to escape from being dependent on the creditor networks of these merchants, and she eventually does right around the time that the Netherlands rebels against Spain. But her solution to this is to cultivate domestic credit markets, right? So the Royal Exchange is founded in 1571 at the urging of Thomas Gresham, partly because the idea is that she should use her subjects in accordance with reason, as he says it. In other words, the point is, why don't you borrow from your subjects because you have power over them, right? You want your creditors to be people that you have political power over, rather than borrowing on foreign markets where you don't have any political power over them. But the irony of this is that what happens as a result of these developments? Well, eventually the domestic creditors acquire the same power over the state that the foreign creditors had, right? So the domestic creditors who are being cultivated by the crown precisely to free the crown from dependence on foreign credit markets eventually gain the same kind of power over the king. And it's a question of, hostages. Now the king is held hostage to Parliament, and then the problem becomes, well, do we really still have a king at all? Because if we need a king in order to be able to guarantee the debt, right? So if the paradox is that if the condition of the king's debt becoming safe is that you make the king no longer a king, well, now who is underwriting who is underwriting the value of this, right? So, okay, there's a lot of stuff, but maybe open the floor for responses to everything that I've just said. Be interested to see what you hear. Is anybody?
Yeah, I have a point. In one of the Youthweight ones, just trying to remember which one it was, but it was about Antwerp. Like Gresham's talking about, the author's talking about how Gresham had like the sort of negotiated the exchange rates to get remittances back into pound, but like, would they be considered a type of option? And like in the case of like when he was waiting for the currency to sort of be favourable, so then he could bring it back and then save money for the crown. Like, Would you consider that, yeah, is that sort of considered an option? Or like also thinking about the way that that option wasn't actually able to be utilized very much, does that fit in with this idea of like the sovereign actually having any choice or not? Like,
Yeah.
in
So
that situation, it didn't.
it's a great question. The point in that and there is that precisely that Gresham has no options. He's very low on options because the point is, so I mean what is, you know, we can conceive of military operations as being about collapsing the options of your opponent, right? If you've ever played a strategy game, I think this will become clear to you, right? I mean, if what you do when you go on the attack is you collapse the options of your opponent, because you say, you have to defend my attack now or else you die, right? So what's happening in this period? Well, I mean, England is under all kinds of military pressure from Spain, and they're being forced to meet those. They don't really have the option to decide to fight now or fight later. I mean, they have to fight now or else the state will be over. And so Gresham is really, the problem is that Gresham has to remit these sums across the channel, and he's time constrained. So he doesn't really have the option to wait. So it's the problem is that it is Gresham's counterparties in the market who have all the options. They're the ones who have the option to wait, to transact now or to transact later. And the problem is that if they know what Gresham is going to do, they know Gresham has to get this much money from Antwerp to London, and he has to do it now. What do? They front run him on the market, right? So this is the whole problem. If you are on the exchange and you know Gresham is going to be buying bills on London in Antwerp, then you buy those bills also and you front run them, and now you're going to raise the price of the exchange, right? So this is why Gresham, when he does a good job, he brags that, you know, I moved this much money without moving the exchange, right? So precisely the problem is that in that situation, the sovereign is powerless because they have no options. They're lacking options vis-a-vis the money markets. And the question becomes, how can they get their options back? I mean, how is it that the sovereign has become captured by the optionality of the money market? Because the money market can decide when to transact, and the sovereign needs to transact now. And you know, and what is the option that so in contrast to this, what is the option that the sovereign has? Well, the option that the sovereign has is non-performance of obligations, right? So Richard says, I was not born to sue, but to command. To get what I want, I don't go through legal proceedings in order to get what I want, because I am the law. And if I decide to default, then that's what I'm going to do. So MacDonald, in his discussion of the Spanish king, because of his kind of liberal Whiggish perspective, right? So he kind of gives you the idea that, you know, these bankruptcies of the Spanish king destroyed the Spanish public credit and all of that stuff. There's a book by Drellickman and Voth called Lending to the Borrower from Hell, which is a good book about the history of Spanish Habsburg crown finance. And kind of the argument that they make in that book is that the impact of these bankruptcies is kind of overstated by the Anglo-centric history, because the English always want to present themselves as being having restrained government in contrast to the absolutism of the Spanish and the French monarchs. So they kind of pride themselves on this restraint of the king. And so there's kind of an Anglo-centric narrative about how the Spanish king is bad and goes bankrupt all the time. But the reality is that these are contingent claims. They're structured write-downs. So basically the contingency of non-payment was already kind of part of the deal from the beginning, and it was kind of priced in. So even though these banking families had payments stopped sometimes on the Spanish debt, like over the long run, they made tons and tons of money. So the sort of like financial irresponsibility of the Spanish crown is a little overstated in some of these sources. But this is precisely the issue, but in the Spanish system, I mean, yes, the king's debt is risky, and those who loan to him know that it's risky, because if the king doesn't perform his contract, then what recourse do you have? None. He's the king. He's the one with the guns. But you get a high rate of interest for that reason. And what's interesting is this transition when we move from the Ancien regime to Nina Boy's regime of sovereign safety, we get the opposite, right? I mean, the sovereign has to pledge itself not to exercise its right to non-performance in order to be able to borrow money cheaply, as opposed to kind of rolling over these high interest short contracts all the time. But precisely what that does is to take this option for devaluation off the table, right? I mean, and it kind of goes back to this stuff that we've been talking about. I mean, in terms of our contemporary context, right? I mean, where are we now? We are in a situation where the sovereign can break its promises in order to defend the value of the money, or it can, in Howe's words, pay a debt it never promised, but in doing so, it subjects its own economy to deflation. And the question is, why can the sovereign have this infinite power in order to print money, in order to defend the money, and can only do that, even and will do that even to the point of the sovereign's own destruction? And this is the issue. So to kind of right, and so kind of what we have to understand in order to understand that situation goes back to this Black-Scholes-Merton equation, because basically, I think maybe I said this before, but I'll say it again, and maybe you are in a position better to understand what I'm saying, is that once you have the technology to make an options market and to buy and sell risk separately from the underlying asset that the risk is of, the financial market gains the ability to generate artificial US debt too. So if modern financial theory defines US debt as the risk-free asset, and then defines all risk in relation to the risk-free asset, and if I then gain the ability to price the risk of my asset separately from the asset itself, and if I sell off all the risk of my asset, what I'm left with is a risk-free asset, which is the same as US debt. I have artificial US debt. That's the Eurodollar market, right? So the Eurodollar market is twice as big as the official Federal Reserve funds market, and it is created by loaning money into existence and then hedging out all of its risk, and what you're left with is a risk-free asset. And so this is defined by modern portfolio theory as being, it should trade at the same price as a US Treasury debt. And what happened in 2008 is that they started to trade at different prices. Right? A spread opens up, Eurodollar market collapses, and sort of this. So as James was talking about in the reading of Boy, this fictional as if collapses, right? So this idea that we can act as though this asset were risk-free, even though we know it really isn't. This kind of narrative suspension of disbelief collapses, and what has to happen? Well, the sovereign steps in, the central bank steps in order to perform the equivalence between treasury bonds and Eurodollars in order to kind of resuspend disbelief in the succession of its dynasty, to put things in Shakespearean terms, right? So when I say that this class is kind of about a dialectic between modern financial theory and modern monetary theory, what I mean is that this gesture precisely exposes the power of the sovereign that was supposed to be contained, right? So prior to 2008, and really kind of, so through the 90s and through the 2000s, financial system is governed by what's called the Greenspan put. I don't know if you've heard of this, but essentially Alan Greenspan, chair of the Federal Reserve for a long time, and essentially his stated policy, right, was basically just to pledge to put a floor on asset prices, right? So basically he says, I do nothing at all until the market starts crashing, and then I'm going to act aggressively in order to keep it from crashing. And because of this, we've solved the business cycle. This is what they thought. There's going to be no more boom bust ever. We solved the problem. And what's interesting is that so the Greenspan put is an example of what I've called a little while ago sovereign indecision. So it's an example of the fact that an option can be worth something even if it isn't being exercised or isn't going to be exercised. So basically the idea of the Greenspan put is that because everybody knows that Greenspan is going to save the market, if it collapses, then the market never has to collapse, and then Greenspan never has to save the market, right? So there is a performativity about his commitment to save the market that actually makes it so that he never has to actually do it, right? And the problem what happened in 2008 is that they actually had to do it. And as soon as they actually do it, as soon as they stop keeping their options open and valuing the option as something that is valuable even if it isn't exercised, and now they have to actually decide, yes, we're going to create all of this money, yes, we're going to swap it for these Eurodollar assets, it raises the political question about what the legitimacy of that is in a way that wasn't the case previously, right? So even though the previous order, constitutional order, is all based upon the fact that the sovereign can do this at any time if it wants to, and because it can do it at any time if it wants to, it never actually has to. Once it's once this is the option collapses, it's forced to be made explicit, and now you have a legitimacy crisis of the state, and the question becomes, it's revealed that this power is really just based on the security apparatus of the state. It's based on the ability of the state to suppress elections, to use the police to throw people out of their houses in order to enforce these bankruptcies and everything. And it just reveals the power that is underlying the system. So you kind of see what I'm saying. I don't know. Anybody else have any more thoughts about this?
I have a couple passages that I wonder like how they fit into this.
Mm-hmm.
I have it here. And I think I'm following, but some of this this isn't a quibble at all, but there's just like a lot going on. So, and like the terms are technical, so it's sort of hard to like stay with all of it, but
great. If there's words I have been swimming in all of these words for a long time, so if you don't know what they mean, please ask, and I'll
Well, it's okay. I'm okay with
Yeah.
looking these things up later and, like going asymmetric with it or whatever. But, okay. So one is, and I didn't write down the acts, but they're all, it's sort of when Hal is tending to his dying father or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then and then also once he's crowned and he's sort of like discussing what that means or whatever. So this one is where he's like looking at his father's crown. And he says, O Majesty, when thou dost pinch thy bearer, thou dost sit like a rich armor worn in heat of day that scalds with safety.
Yep, great.
And I thought that's really interesting, right? Because it's like safety, security.
This is one of my 5 passages that I marked down to look at. So good. This is it's Act 4, Scene 3, line 155, or around there. Yeah. So go ahead.
And then the second one was sort of at the end. It might actually be the last passage, or one of the last passages before they like whatever. Like Hal says, "The tide of blood in me hath proudly flowed in vanity till now. Now doth it turn and ebb back to the sea, where it shall mingle with the state of floods and flow henceforth in formal majesty." And this is like super interesting on a bunch of levels. But to me, it's like sort of thinking, the only sort of language I have for this is sort of thinking about the like material of the blood in the king and the material, like a materialist view of like a monarchical material or something, or like the monarchy and the blood of the monarchy. And it's sort of in some way, maybe like as an option, it sort of has some sort of, you could say liquidity or something, but like these flows. But it's nice because it's in this term of sort of like estuaries. So I'm trying to think about it in terms of like, I heard the term recently, like political ecology, and that's a different thing, I think, than what you're up to. But like, yeah, I don't really have a question. Those are just two, like I'm hanging on to these two things because they're really generative for me.
It's great. It's fantastic. Yeah. So I'd like to look at that speech that Hal gives where he takes the crown, right? So just to this is the scene where Henry IV is on his deathbed, and Hal comes in, and the crown is on the pillow next to his father, and he thinks his father is dead, and he takes the crown and puts it on his head, and then Henry IV wakes up, and he's like, oh, you couldn't even wait like half an hour for me to die, you know, you're already. So there's this anxiety about he's being usurped by his son, right? So his own issue is a threat to him because it threatens to usurp him. And then Hal kind of comes back and he apologizes, right? And then he gives this whole discourse about, you know, how basically, you know, the crown is heavy on the head of the one who wears it, right? So, I mean, there's this idea that, you know, I mean, this is the question: is sovereignty power or is sovereignty a burden? I mean, because the problem is that, I mean, we might think that sovereignty is power, and we might depend upon, like, if sovereignty isn't power, then that's really threatening to the social order, right? I mean, if sovereign and for 16th century English people, this was very real. I mean, right? I mean, they've just lived through 200 years of civil war, basically, over the question of the legitimacy of sovereignty, and which is very much wrapped up in Protestant versus Catholic kind of stuff. And so this idea that as right, that the crown is when thou dost pinch thy bearer, thou dost sit like a rich armor worn in heat of day that scaldest with safety, right? So I mean, is this safety really power, or is it more of like a straitjacket, right? I mean, and that is the question about, you know, whether the imperial monetary power that the U.S. exercises is really a privilege or a burden, right? So I don't know if we've talked about this. So in the 50s, I believe this is where this comes from. The French finance manager Gerard d'Estaing coined the term exorbitant privilege, and his point was that because the U.S. dollar is the reserve currency of the world, the U.S. has the ability to trade pieces of paper for real goods and services. And in addition, more importantly, the U.S. funds the military encirclement of the rest of the world with money that the rest of the world loans to it. So because the rest of the world has to collect dollars, basically this is a funding mechanism for the U.S. to fund the military that then we use to encircle the rest of the world, right? So this is the idea of exorbitant privilege. But what comes out after 2008, and so we talked about Trump a little bit, and I really believe that Trump himself believes, to the extent that he believes anything, depending on how he wakes up in the morning or who he talked to or what he saw on television that day or whatever. But I think a lot of the impetus towards Trump is this idea that the exorbitant privilege has become an exorbitant burden, essentially because of the fact that during normal periods, when there's not a financial crisis, the US gets to export dollars for real stuff, and that's good. But when there is a financial crisis, now the United States has the obligation to save the rest of the global financial economy by paying in order to protect all of their financial assets. And there have been some mainstream economists who have tried to price this. So they've tried this. So essentially the idea is that the US is selling implicitly insurance to the rest of the world. So what the US gets during normal time is a premium on the insurance that it's selling. And then the question is, what happens when the financial crisis comes and you have to pay out the insurance policy? You might decide, oh man, I wish we hadn't been selling this insurance for the last 15 years or whatever. And so I think that's very much right. So is maybe this imperial crown that seems like power is actually a kind of burden. And I think that, I think that given this kind of context of late 16th century, 17th century English kings who are really deeply struggling to raise the revenues that they need in order to maintain kingship, and is putting them in a position of powerlessness vis-a-vis their own subjects and foreign merchants and all of this stuff. I mean, there is precisely that idea. In this problem, of whether the crown is really worth it. So I think that's interesting about that scene that you pointed to, and what you raised with the question of blood is what I wanted to talk about next time. So I think this is really excellent. So where the king at one point, So when he is, so let's look at, so this is Act 4, Scene 3, and the king says, most subject is the fattest soil to weeds. You can search on there. So the king is complaining about his son. He says, most subject is the fattest soil to weeds, and he, the noble image of my youth, is overspread with them. Therefore, my grief stretches itself beyond the hour of death. The blood weeps from my heart when I do shape and forms imaginary the unguided days and rotten times that you shall look upon when I am sleeping with my ancestors. For when his headstrong riot hath no curb, when rage and hot blood are his counselors, when means and lavish manners meet together, oh, with what wings shall his affections fly towards fronting peril and opposed decay, right? So he's complaining. Well, my son hangs out with all these terrible people. He is my image. He is the image of me, but he's kind of debasing me by being my image. And Warwick defends how, and how does he defend? And this is a very famous line. He says, my gracious lord, you look beyond him quite. The prince but studies his companions like a strange tongue, wherein to gain the language 'tis needful that the most immodest word be looked upon and heard, which, once attained, your highness knows, comes to no further youth, but to be known and hated. So, like gross terms, the prince will in perfectness of time cast off his followers, and their memory shall as a pattern or a measure live, by which his grace must meet the lives of other, turning past evils to advantages. Okay, so what is Warwick saying? Well, the prince is hanging out with all of these lowlives because he's studying them like a foreign tongue, and as a result of this, he is going to be a better king, right? So the trajectory of these plays is a bit like, Hal is a bad coin. He's bad money that circulates among bad people, and then he has to be restored. And I'm going to look at a scene where he says this in just a second. He's restored, but as a result of that process, he becomes a better king because sort of he understands the low world of commerce and money and all of these things. And if we can kind of put that in the context of the historical readings that we've been doing, that are what I'm hoping to show you is that contrary to the MMT story, according to which all money comes from sovereigns taxing and all of this stuff, what early modern rulers are doing is they are hijacking a system of merchant credit in order to fund their own states, right? So this whole system of finance already exists and is created purely by private parties, maybe with some rules given by the church and all of this stuff, but they create it themselves. And it's the states that are turning this system of exchange by bills to their own uses in order to turn it into a kind of public credit. And so, but the problem is that this is not what kings are supposed to be doing, right? Kings are supposed to be taking stuff by force because it's theirs, right? They're not supposed to be borrowing money and entering into contracts with merchants in order to fund their state, right? I mean, this is, and the problem is, what's the danger of that? I mean, the danger of that is that it puts them into the kind of trap of Richard II, where Richard II ends up being more and more in debt and having to pawn his lands, right? So Richard mortgaging his crown lands is supposed to call to mind the dissolution of the monasteries of Henry VII, right? So I mean, there's this idea of squandering the traditional endowments of the land and all this stuff. So my path is forking. But as far as the blood, I want to talk more about this next time, so I don't want to give you my whole reading of this, but yes, I'm going to give you an argument next time about how lineage is an option. Aristocratic lineage is an option, and that is the problem. And so we have on one hand the problem of sons. So when the king says most subject is the fattest soil to weeds, right? The point is that if you have all this good soil, well, that's going to generate weeds. So there's kind of a success breeds failure, and the problem is that the problem is when as he rebukes Hal at one point when Hal is off stage wearing the crown, and he says basically that nature is perverted when its object turns to gold, right? And the problem is that when you have a dynasty that owns a lot of property, you have conflict between sons who fight over it and who are going to possibly undermine the entire conditions of the dynasty. And sort of the more successful your dynasty is, the higher the stakes of the conflict between sons. So one problem of aristocratic lineage, of the blood as an option, is this problem of sons. And the other problem is the problem of women, and is the problem of succession through the female line, which I think we've talked about a little bit before. But so essentially, so James I becomes the king of England in 1603 because Henry VII had married his daughter to the King of Scotland like 100 years before. So essentially, the reason that James has this option on the crown of England is because he is descended from Henry VII through the female line. And what's interesting is that we can then construct a theory according to which, like, so why does Henry VII do this? Well, it's to buy peace with Scotland, right? So, I mean, aristocratic women are traded among families in order to make alliances and everything. And in a way, it's a form of collateral, right? I mean, if I marry my daughter to you, you now have my daughter. And not only do you have, not only do you have my daughter, but you have control over my own descendants. I mean, you now have my descendants in your power, and so I'm going to be less inclined to go to war with you, right? But sort of the issue is that as these lineages branch out, that's what creates civil war over the crown, right? So there's the whole problem of you kind of need to have extra heirs to make sure the crown, the dynasty doesn't die out. But the more extra heirs you produce, the more unstable the dynasty becomes. So the production of heirs is both a response to volatility and a cause of volatility in the aristocratic line. So I think that's something to think about. But I mean, so that's one way that we might take this idea of blood. I think, of course, the other idea that's associated with blood is the question of circulation, right? So, I mean, you may know that I don't know when exactly, does anybody know when Harvey, the physician Harvey, is writing? So there's this guy Harvey, who is the origin of the modern circulation theory of blood. So people used to think that the heart produced blood and then sent it out to the parts of the body where it was consumed, right? Which is actually, if you think about, I think we've talked before about kind of the folk belief that money is consumed when you spend it, right? So like most people think that when you spend money, the money goes away, it vanishes. They don't really have this idea that money isn't destroyed when you spend it is actually a kind of difficult idea for people to wrap their heads around sometimes. But it's circulationist, right? So this idea that the school of economics that Boyer-Xambeau are kind of writing in is called the French circulationist school, I believe, or the circuitist school or whatever. But the whole point is that there's a circuit established between the state spending money and then taxing it back out of existence, and this is the monetary circuit, as opposed to the idea that money is kind of created in one place and then consumed in another place, which is the old idea of blood. And I'm called to mind. There's a I don't think I can flip to it quickly, maybe, but there's a scene where Falstaff is opining about the virtues of drunkenness, and he's essentially saying that, where does he say? I mean, he basically says that money in a hoard is no good, and like wine is good because it makes you spend your money in order to drink it. So he says that sack or wine sets money in motion, and that this is what's important about it, right? So, which I mean relates to this. There's this tension, right, between what matters about money that you can hoard it, or is what matters about money that you can circulate it, or that it circulates, right? Is money in virtue of being stable and of being something that you, so John Locke's whole theory about why property is justified is that if you grow more food than you can eat and you sell it for money, the money doesn't rot and you can just keep it. and so therefore it's justified because you didn't waste anything. This is his justification of private property. And there we get this idea that the fundamental goal of money is to be something that you can hoard and you can save. And what part of what we're exploring here, right, is this problem. There's actually a contradiction between the ability of money to circulate and the ability of money to be hoarded. That the better money is at being a store of value, the less good it is at being a means of circulation. And there's an inherent contradiction between those things. And this is the difference between good and bad money. I mean, so in order for, this paradox that Falstaff kind of represents is that kind of like money is necessarily bad money. Like good money can't even be money. In order to be money, it has to be bad. And now we have maybe the same question about kingship. I mean, what if the good king can't be the king? Only the bad king can be the king. And then there's the problem that you have, right? So as Henry IV is dying, I mean, he says to Hal basically, my seizure of the crown was illegitimate, because I took it from Richard, and this has been a whole problem, and that's what's caused all these rebellions that I've been dealing with my entire reign. But now you've inherited it, and so hopefully that will make your position more stable, right? So that that inheritance is secure. And so where I want to go next time, talking a little bit more about lineage, right, is to ask, okay, I mean, maybe there's something inherently unstable about inheritance that kind of needs to be solved by this modern regime in order to make modern money possible. Right? I mean, because really, I mean, what happens after the Glorious Revolution is that Parliament becomes in charge of picking the king. And kind of what's additionally interesting, so in the James, I think it was James MacDonald writes about the Act of Settlement of 1701 or something like that. And what's interesting about that is that they passed over like 50 or 60 people. So like they were trying to decide who would succeed William and Mary as the English king, and they didn't want any Catholics. But like the first 60 people in line were Catholics or something like this, and so they passed over them all, and that's the origin of the modern English crown is through this. I mean, it's because they're Protestants, right? So I mean, Parliament really gets the ability to decide the succession, and kind of in so doing, gets rid of this whole problem about the problem of sons, the problem of cognatic succession, and all this kind of stuff. But yeah, so great. I mean, even if I know that the Shakespeare it can be impenetrable if you're not really used to getting into it, but even just being like, oh, there seems to be something going on, in this scene that's like what we're talking about. I mean, that's great. It's the first step, and I think you're exactly right. So, anybody else want to jump in with some comments?
I had a kind of historical question that came up in the MacDonald and Boy papers, and it was kind of brought to mind by that idea of exorbitant privilege that you were talking about. So I'm just questioning like how military power historically did or did not protect states' financial interests, because like MacDonald had mentioned that the budget surplus in like the 1630s couldn't be diverted to a standing army. Like that was a really unpopular idea, as was a peacetime standing army, like that the Commonwealth wanted to maintain. But then Boy says that by like, I guess it's the early 18th century, that those joint stock companies were central colonizing forces, right? And they were equipped with armies, and then they were authorized to defend those trade routes. So I guess I'm misunderstanding or making a false parallel between those scenarios, but I'm just curious if you could clarify that trajectory at all.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So part of the point that's being made in, I don't know, the various readings that we had, right, is that the crown is really piggybacking on the credit of its own domestic merchant class, right? That is how it is able to raise cheap credit at longer term. So, it's through basically by getting the city of London, the merchant community of the city of London to underwrite the public credit. That's what enables them to eventually start raising cash in exchange for bonds, right? So they're able to raise cash, by which I mean hard money, gold and silver, and the only security that the lenders need is bonds drawn on the city. But this depends upon a political unification between the aristocratic elites and the merchants, and this is the Whigs, right? And the Tories are the country party, so they're not part of this alliance between the city and the aristocracy. That is what enables the crown to use the merchant's good credit for its own purposes, right? This is what I've been trying to emphasize through all of these readings, is that it doesn't start with the state. It starts with the merchants and their exchange with one another, and then the state learns how to use this network in order to raise money for itself. And so really, so what's happening with these chartered corporations, I think you raise a really great point to point out that they have armies of their own, right? So the issue is there's this resistance to having a standing army controlled by the state, but somehow it's more okay if the merchant company has the standing army. So like, not only has the credit been outsourced to these corporations, but military force has been also the means of discipline that underpins the credit system. And so I mean, buying stock, because these companies, the South Sea Company is one of the major creditors of the crown. If I, as a member of the public, buy stock in the South Sea Company, I'm becoming an indirect creditor of the crown, and so it's a disguised form of public debt. But what's interesting about it precisely is that, like, we've outsourced the means of violence to this chartered corporate company, and that's part of what makes it okay. I mean, like, you know, it's what I mean. This is what I mean. The whole point is it's just a question of legitimacy. It's a question of, like, what induces a big enough portion of the public, or the money holding public, to think it's okay to loan you money. And well, I mean, it requires the state divesting itself of state functions of various kinds, right? So there's this whole process of the state emptying itself of state functions, which I think we see in Richard, right? Richard dramatizes this when he kind of dramatically abdicates the throne, and he kind of gets rid of his scepter and gets rid of his crown. There's this image of the state emptying itself of its own sovereignty. That is somehow what makes it okay to have the state be so in debt, right? And I mean, I think it's not hard to see a connection to, like, what we call neoliberalism in the 20th century. We have the state is becoming more and more financialized and indebted, and what does it do as a part of this process? Well, it outsources state functions to the private sector. And I think part of the point of this is that what does this do? Well, it makes the debt safer, because the crown has put revenue streams in the hands of the corporation. So rather than the debt being backed by the state's ability to tax, it is backed by the corporation's ability to have revenue streams in the economy, and that is somehow safer, right? So the paradox that has to be solved by what I call the liberal constitution, the identity between sovereign and subject, is the fact that if the crown is in debt to its own subjects, and if it can't pay, it's faced with a paradox. It has two choices. Either it has to abolish the debt, in which case it is seizing my property illegitimately, or it has to tax in order to pay the debt, in which case it is also seizing my property illegitimately. So the problem is that if the crown has this debt that is accruing and this debt burden, the only way that it can deal with this is to seize property one way or the other. Both situations are illegitimate. And so kind of what helps to solve this problem is, if what is being pledged to debt service is no longer taxation of the domestic economy, but revenues from the colonial economy, it turns this conflict outwards, right? And I hope you notice at the end of Henry IV, how basically is like, well, okay, so I can't find the passage, but basically he's like, well, okay, so I've gotten rid of Falstaff, and I've forgiven the judge, and we executed the rebels, and I've kind of like put society back in order. And so what are we going to do now? Well, we're going to go on crusade. Time to go find some foreign military adventures to divert all of this domestic struggle outwards, right? And so there's very much, a different analysis, but a similar force to the classic like Leninist theory of imperialism, right? I mean, there are contradictions of capitalism. The contradictions are solved by imperial adventures outwards, projecting these contradictions outward to the periphery. And so we'll see more of that. The Henry V, there's a lot more stuff about crusades and all of this kind of stuff. So so I hope that maybe it kind of addresses your question. But I mean, I think it's very much, I mean, it's the point is that these private corporations, because public debt, the ability of sovereigns to raise public debt is really them hijacking merchant credit systems. They need the merchants to be on board with this project, and the merchants have a surprising amount of power over the sovereigns. And so it's only by so basically the state, there's a swap, right? The state gets the ability to raise credit like merchants do, but what do they have to give up in exchange for this? They have to give merchants the power to act like a state and have gunships and all of this kind of stuff, So, yeah, I mean, and here we are now. Okay, so just one more passage I want to look at briefly. This is 5:2. So there's a speech that Howe gives that begins with, "You are right, Justice, and you weigh this well." So this is after the justice has finished giving him a speech about how now that you're king, you would want me to act like I did before when I threw you in prison, so don't punish me. And he gives this whole speech. I won't read the whole thing, but at line 120, around 125, he says, "My father is gone wild into his grave, for in his tomb lie my affections. And with his spirits sadly I survive, to mock the expectation of the world, to frustrate prophecies, and to raise out rotten opinion, who hath written me down after my seeming. The tide of blood in me hath proudly flowed in vanity till now." Oh, this is the scene this is exactly that you were quoting, William. "Now doth it turn and ebb back to the sea, blah, 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 blah." So I just want to notice this one phrase where he says, "Rotten opinion, who hath written me down after my seeming." Can anybody, why am I interested? Anybody want to see if they can, what is this about? What does it mean? Writ me, there's a metaphor here, which is very much about what we've been talking about. What is his metaphor when he says that the world, so what am I going to do? I'm going to mock the expectation of the world. We saw him say something similar to this before, right? Everybody thinks I'm bad and I'm worthless. I'm going to be a bad king, but I'm going to mock their expectation by actually being a good king. What does he say? But what writ me down after my seeming? What does this mean? What's he comparing himself to? What do we do when we write down, when something is written down? What is this in modern finance? It means to reduce the value of something, right? So if you write down assets, it means so the Fed does what's called mark-to-market accounting. I don't know, have you ever heard of this? So the Federal Reserve, so banks have reserve requirements, right? So banks create money by loaning it into existence. And as long as nobody wants to call in all the debts at once, this is fine. That's fractional reserve banking. The question is, how much reserves should the banks have in order to back up their liabilities? And what's interesting is that this is sort of an arbitrary question. There's no like objective answer to how much reserves banks should have, but the federal, so it is the job of the Federal Reserve. This is sort of why it's called the Federal Reserve, is to regulate the reserves of the banking system, and it allows certain kinds of assets to be acceptable as collateral, right? So part of the problem in 2008 is that these bad mortgages were bundled up into MBS, which were treated as safe assets. So they were rated AAA. the same as sovereign debt, essentially. But so the Federal Reserve is in charge of deciding which assets banks can use as reserves, and the rule is that they have to mark to market at the end of the day. So say that I'm a bank and I have these assets that I'm using as reserve. I have MBS, and the market starts crashing. I have to value them at the market price at the end of the day, which means that my reserves are gonna collapse if they start collapsing, right? So, but what Hal is making a metaphor of here is coinage being written down after its value, right? So so as we read in Boyer-Xambeau, kind of what the sovereign wants to do is to prevent the development of what they call voluntary price. So the voluntary price is the price that the market values the coin at. Which is not necessarily the same as the nominal price, the value that the king wants the coin to be valued at. So what Hal is saying here is that the world has decided that my real value is less than my nominal value, right? My nominal value is that I'm the prince, but I'm being traded below my value, right? So because I seem to be less valuable than I am. So he's saying the world has written me down after my seeming, and what he's going to do is going to defy their expectations in order to raise his value back up. And this is interesting. I think for a number of reasons, I keep coming back to this, but it's interesting. So what he's doing here is saying that he's going to squeeze the shorts. So if you short an asset, right? So say coronavirus happens, markets start. This has been the kind of financial drama of the last month, right? Coronavirus comes, markets start panicking, and what do people do? Well, if you're like my friend, the hedge fund guy, you start selling everything short. You start buying far out of the money puts, which is a way to sell things short. Now, the problem is that if you have a portfolio of puts, of shorts, you have to fund that portfolio. It costs you money in order to hold all of these assets. So you're waiting for the market to crash. And the question is whether you can hold on long enough, whether you can fund your portfolio of shorts long enough for the market to crash. And the Federal Reserve is trying to stop this. So what is the Federal Reserve doing? Well, it is trying to buy assets in order to prop up their value. So what happens in these financial crises is a contest between people who are trying to short the market, who are betting that things are actually worth less than they seem to be, and the Fed, which is trying to make all these people go bankrupt by printing money out of nothing in order to buy up assets, in order to punish people who are trying to short the market and who are making the market fall by shorting it, right? There's a feedback loop between these things. And what's interesting is that the kind of financial history after 2008 was very much about the investing public learning that it's impossible to fight the Fed, right? Basically that the Fed has omnipotent power and that you can't short the market. So there's this conflict between the sovereign that wants to use its sovereignty in order to protect the value of assets, and people who might think, this stuff isn't, the Fed's printing money, it's making everything worthless, soon we'll be back on the gold standard, like these kind of people who are trying to short it. And there's a conflict between who can hold on longer. And what's interesting is that basically after 2008, the Fed drove all the shorts out of the market. Everybody who said, the Fed can't really have this power to infinitely print money however it wants. They all lost everything. And everybody got kind of traumatized. And basically there's this idea that you can't do, all investing is just trying to trade with the Fed, right? The Fed has the complete power to dictate asset prices. And part of what is going to be interesting going forward is whether, the Fed seems to have successfully kind of stopped the monetary panic surrounding coronavirus now, but the question is whether this era of 2008, 2020 like seeming central bank omnipotence is over or not. And I think we need to keep watching and see. Anyway, but I just think I just to emphasize to you the way in which Shakespeare is presenting Hal as a bad coin who circulates around the bad world and learns stuff, but then is able to kind of take this knowledge of the essential badness of money in order to then kind of refound some new constitutional order that will be stable. I mean, that is, yeah. Anyway,
I have a question.
Yes, great.
I'm thinking about this idea of like metallic currencies and things, and just kind of thinking about what you said in terms of like the option of like melting it down. But is there any sort of like general correlation between like the development, so I guess like the volatility of like the rule of like the sovereign, so that like there's a historical period where the king might have been deposed more easily and the state might like collapse, and then like moving into the modern period where like states generally, at least in the West, are more like able to like continuously rule, like does sort of like having this belief that like the state might collapse is sort of investing in like a metallic currency, like a kind of outcome of like hedging against the state's continued existence, so that, you know, thinking about people like doomsday preppers, like hoarding loads of like precious metals, like they're trying to kind of, yeah, their option is like the state's failure.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying, right? I mean, so the point is that if we no longer think about, so it's different than a commodity theory of money, kind of what I'm saying. So this is the difference, right? So traditional theory of money says, you know, money is valuable because it's gold, and gold is intrinsically valuable, and it's a commodity, and like that's how it should be. And if the money ever diverges from its value as gold, then that's like a problem or an anomaly or something. And the Chartists in Chartist Critique of John Locke say, no. Gold is irrelevant. Money is always just a token, and the fact that it's made of gold is just because kind of people like it, you know, for cultural reasons. So those are kind of the two options. But if instead we have what I'm saying is exactly what you're saying here, right? Which is that the gold, it's not that is the value of the money, it's that it's necessarily less than the value of the money, precisely because it is an option, and it is an option on the non-continuance of the state. Exactly. I mean, in order for me to accept the king's money, there's a part of the coin that is purely valuable because of the name of the king, because it's got the king's name on it, and there's a part of it that is valuable because it's gold, because I can melt it and use it on international markets. And the relative size of those things is going to be an index of my faith in the stability of the regime. And so there is precisely a kind of paradox there, which is that like if money needs to be bad to circulate, then like it requires me to have more and more faith in the inevitability of the regime. And when I start to lose faith in the political inevitability of the continuation of the regime, you're going to start demanding more and more gold or more collateral in the money, which is going to drive it out of circulation. So it's going to cease to be monetized, and then you will be kind of colonized by the international monetary system. So you kind of cease to have any kind of domestic money, right? So this, so I was talking with one of my friends who's from Somalia, and it's interesting because Somalia, you know, is stateless, which is a little bit of an exaggeration, I think, based on our conversations, but it's a totally dollarized economy, right? So everything that happens in Somalia, there is a local currency, but it's only used in certain kinds of transactions, right? So I mean, but the point is that if your economy runs on dollars, you have no ability to devalue your money if you start having a debt crisis or something like this, right? So it is possible that you might have money circulating in an economy that is sort of monetized by something that exists outside of your economy, right? I mean, it is money because it circulates in the international monetary system. But then you're subject to the international monetary system. And sort of the whole problem of the coin of the realm is the question about how the state can insulate itself from the international monetary system without totally severing itself from the international monetary system. Because I in order, if I have a complete autarkic economy and I don't have any dependence on foreigners and everything, yeah, maybe I can issue all of my subjects bad money and nothing but bad money. But to the extent that my subjects are able to kind of like put political pressure on me, they're able to threaten to rebel, they're able to, do various kinds of things, I might be forced to issue them collateral in the coins. And that precisely is like undermining, it's a process of negotiation, right? I mean, and it is a process of negotiation that is like based upon the threat of mutual annihilation, right? I mean, it's sort of a standoff. I mean, the question of like how much collateral has to be issued in the coin is a question of like, how credible is the threat of Parliament to rebel and chop off the head of the king? Like, how credible is the threat of the king to crush rebellion? I mean, which might end up creating more problems I forget who it is, says to the rebels. Yeah, I mean, precisely. So I mean, the problem is that the collateral is a hedge against political risk, and that collateral has always been issued as part of money until the modern period. And like, the question for me is that I'm like trying to think about is like, so like one way we could think about this is saying, look, there's this hard break. So like, yeah, in the past there was like collateral in the money, but now it doesn't work like that anymore, and it just went away. So this whole problem just kind of vanished, and now, God is dead, everything is permitted, coins can just kind of, the state can just kind of say what the value of the money is, and it's omnipotent. I'm skeptical of this because my hunch is it has to still be there, it just went someplace else. And so like my question is, if this is the political struggle that makes money, and it's been displaced or suppressed by the development of the modern financial state and the liberal constitution, like the question for me kind of becomes like, where did it go? Like, where did this contradiction go? Can we find it popping up anywhere else? And, and I think, and part of the answer for me, my hypothesis about this stuff is that the difference between good and bad money has kind of gone into the difference between bonds and cash. Like, so it used to be in this Ancien regime, the cash is the good money. It's actually got gold in it. And the bonds are the kind of the uncertain. It's uncertain whether it's going to be paid or not. But what's interesting is that in the modern regime, you can manipulate the prices of bonds and cash separately. And so the state can kind of pledge to defend bonds against cash. So they'll say, if you hold bonds, this is like a safer kind of money than if you hold cash. And if you notice, like, this is why, so like volatility happens in the world, and the price, the interest rate the US pays on debt actually goes down because there's a flight to safety, because everybody is saying, oh, this is safe. But what's interesting is that it's no longer, it's still in the hands of politics. Like the political risk is being hedged against by politics. So what is the political risk of the money? The political risk of the money is that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez becomes president, and they do MMT, and they start printing all of this money, and all of the creditors lose value in their investments. I mean, that's the political risk. But it seems like it's being hedged against by something that is itself political, and that's very strange. I mean, but this is the question. I mean, why does nobody demand collateral in their money anymore? Like has the public really become so, like, is it the total, who lost, who won? I don't know. Is it that we don't need collateral in the money anymore because the king won and we don't have the power to demand collateral in the money? Or is there no collateral in the money because the merchants won and they don't need it anymore? Are the merchants, the financial class, so secure in their dominance over the state that there's no longer the need for collateral? I mean, or is the collateral in another form? I mean, who won, who lost? It kind of depends on your ideological convictions, because if you're on the right, the state won. I mean, the state suppressed the gold system, and it has tyrannical power to print money however it wants, and that's basically like, that's why we had Weimar Germany and all of this stuff. Or on the other hand, you might say, well, I mean, the merchants won. I mean, the problem is that the state has been totally captured by financial power, and I mean, maybe all of us are collateral for the money. I mean, because they can, if there's a financial crisis, they can back up the money by seizing our pensions, or seizing our houses, and seizing our wealth, and all of this kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, why doesn't the financial system really fear the end of the empire? It's just kind of astounding. I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe part of the answer has to do with nuclear weapons. I mean, maybe like because of nuclear deterrence, it's like so unthinkable that the United States dollar system could ever end. If the United States shows that it would like rather blow up the world with nukes than allow the dollar system to collapse, maybe it becomes unthinkable for that reason. I don't know. But I mean, it is kind of as Nina Boy is arguing. I mean, this idea of the risk-free asset requires a repression, and it requires a repression of just like history, just like our basic historical knowledge that like United States empire, it's not that old by standards of empires. It's like pretty fragile. Like it doesn't seem like it can possibly go on forever, but we have to assume that it cannot, right? We have to assume that it is impossible that the United States debt could ever not be paid, because it's the foundation of everything. So I mean, there's I don't know. These are deep problems. I don't know if I have the answer to them.
Oh, when you say like it's impossible that the United States debt cannot be paid, what does that mean? That it's impossible that the United States won't pay its debt, or that, what does that mean? Because it's unclear to me what the United States is, which is also part of this. I feel like it's sort of a ghost state in some ways.
Yeah, well, it's the king's. I mean, the question is who pay. I mean, it's the king's immortal body is the one who pays. It's not the real flesh and blood king, or it's the corporate person of the. So I mean, it's the treasury, right? I mean, so but I mean, what does it mean to? Why is it impossible? I mean, it's well, okay. I mean, this is why. I don't know if I successfully made this point earlier, so I'll say it again. I mean, but this dialectic. Go ahead.
This might be the question, because it's a rudimentary question, and I just I'm not solid on it. Like, what is a bond? What is a government bond?
Is a promise to pay dollars at a certain point in the future.
Well, like, what does that actually mean? Like, the government issues bonds. Like, you get the bond from the government.
Yes.
So like, I know it's like basic, and therefore like ubiquitous. Like, but what is, like, who buys bonds? Why do you buy a bond?
Well, bonds are originally bought by the prime dealers, and then they are resold. So there are these actors called the banks called the prime dealers, and they have special access to the treasury market. So when the treasury sells a bond, they swap dollars for a bond. So you're a prime dealer, so you're Goldman Sachs, and you bid on these bonds, and you trade dollars, cash, for a promise $4 in 10 or 30 years or whatever. And whatever price those bonds sell at determines the interest rate of the bonds. But the question of, so this is why there's this is why modern financial theory and modern monetary theory are dialectical opposites, is because modern financial theory is based upon the idea that the US bond is risk-free because of MMT. The point is that the United States bond is risk-free because the government can never be forced to default on it, because it can always just print more money in order to pay the bonds. So if I'm the U.S. and so this is the thing, right? So when the U.S. pays its debt, all it's doing is swapping one form of its liability for another form of its liability. It is paying its debt with its own debt. That's all it's doing. And so it never ever actually liquidates its debt. It just swaps the form of the debt over and over again, right? So $100 is the U.S. owes you $100. $100 worth of bonds is the U.S. owes you $100. The only thing that's different is when they owe you that $100. Right? So the $100, the bond is $100 30 years from now, and what matters is the liquidity of those markets. What matters is the fact that the bond is basically as good as money because it is liquid, which means that it is very cheap for you to turn it into money at any time that you want to do that. So the bond is basically, in 1571, when Thomas Gresham and Elizabeth established the Royal Exchange, what they're trying to do is to develop more deep and liquid markets in credit domestically. So the fact that the entire world trades constantly every day bonds for dollars every single day, right? So like if you're an institution, if you're a university, you're doing this all the time, because if you have money sitting around in your accounts and you don't need to pay it yet, but you don't want it just sitting there because it doesn't earn any interest, right? US dollars are a form of US debt that is zero coupon. It doesn't earn any interest. And so you want to swap it for a form of US debt that does earn interest. And so there's huge markets every day, huge volume of transactions where you're swapping different forms of US debt against one another. And this makes it liquid. So it's very cheap for you if all of a sudden you're like, oh, I need to sell my bond so that I can get cash. It doesn't really cost you anything to do that. So it's basically like money. And if there ever is a liquidity crisis, if it ever stops to be the case, right? So say everybody needs dollars all of a sudden, like happened 3 weeks ago. All of a sudden, everybody needs dollars. Nobody wants to give up their dollars for bonds. Well, what happens? I mean, the price of the bond starts collapsing, which means the price of the interest rate goes up. But then the Federal Reserve just steps in and says, we'll buy them. We'll create money out of nothing in order to buy the bonds, in order to push the price back up. And so if the Federal Reserve guarantees that, then it's impossible that the market could ever cease to be liquid. The only way that it could ever cease to be liquid is if the Federal Reserve ceases to exist, or if the rest of the world ceases to use dollars or something, right? But kind of what I want to suggest, and the reason that I think it's important to look at this like English history to understand this stuff, I mean, it really is a question of civil war. It's a question of like what is the limit on the ability of the bank, the Federal Reserve, to infinitely defend the liquidity of US debt? Well, if there's no outside to the system, the Federal Reserve, unlike the Bank of England, unlike the Bank of England in the 18th century, the Federal Reserve does not have any obligation to ship gold out of its vaults. It used to. We ended that in 1971 because Charles de Gaulle tried to call in the debts. Charles de Gaulle sent a destroyer to New York and he said, I'd like my gold now. And Nixon said, no, we're closing the window. And so there's no outside money. And so like, what is de Gaulle going to do? I mean, he would have had to send more destroyers and we would have had to start a war, right? So we might have a theory of money, right? According to which money is, this is the point. We might have a theory of money according to which money is a veil over the real economy. And the constraint on the production of money is like technical or mechanical, right? I mean, like economists like to imagine the money is like, the economy is like a bathtub, and if you add too much money, then it evens out and everything. What I'm trying to show you is that the limit is military and political, and it's a limit of legitimacy. And so the question is like, what would cause the world to cease to believe in the legitimacy of the king, of the US dollar, and what is the price that it would have to pay in order to rebel against the king and cut its head off? I mean, but outside of that, there's no limit. There's no limit to the process. It can go on forever. Like, there just is no limit. The numbers go to infinity, and that's all it is. It's just numbers. And so it reconceives, it forces us to kind of reconsider the way we think about the limits of financialization, right? And it's very different from what you'll find in Marx, the Marxist theory of fictitious capital, which basically says that fictitious capital can only, it gets out of whack with the real development of value, and there must eventually be a law of gravity, which is going to kind of, the Marxist theory of the value form has to say that basically sovereignty is impotent, that sovereignty doesn't really have any power in the long run to intervene into the monetary system in order to do stuff. And that's an optimistic theory. If only that were true. In fact, the problem is there is no limit. There is no limit to the production of fictitious capital other than civil war. Yeah. Okay. Well, we're out of time for next time. We're out of time for today. So for next time, we'll read Henry V. Read some of this, and I'm going to talk more about this question of blood and lineage and stuff like that, and talk a little bit about Deleuze too. So, well, thank you so much for coming, and I'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.